Recently, I played through Dark Souls 3 for the first time, and this marked the end of my journey with Dark Souls, as I had now played through all 3 games in the trilogy. But as I was playing through the 3rd game, I was also watching somebody's playthrough of the first game on the side. And seeing both games one after the other like this, I started to notice problems with the first game. Small ones at first, but then bigger ones started popping up and they became more frequent. So, my interest peaked, I replayed Dark Souls 1 and came to the conclusion that Dark Souls is ready for a remake. That almost feels blasphemous to say, but keep in mind, it's a 14-year-old game at this point, and I think it's starting to show its age in multiple ways. Now don't get me wrong, Dark Souls 1 is still good, but I want it to be a masterpiece again. So see this video as a sort of pitch. A pitch to why it's time to remake specifically the first Dark Souls game. What to change, but almost just as important, what not to change when remaking such a landmark and important game. Quick warning, I am going to spoil this entire game. And if you haven't played Dark Souls yet, I advise you to not watch this video. Playing through Dark Souls for the first time can truly be a magical experience, and I don't want to take that away from somebody. Especially if we do end up getting a remake that fixes its problems. For some, a potential remake of Dark Souls doesn't have to go that big, or make any extreme changes. Just small stuff like maybe changing some of the bonfire locations to improve runbacks to certain bosses, match the menu designs to that of the sequels, improve the graphics a bit and fix some mistakes like making it more readable when certain enemies have dropped an item, for example. And I'm definitely for all these changes. These are all essential things that I think everybody wants to see in a remake. In fact, all of these things should have been in the remaster, which I think now is a good time to bring up. Because I want to make clear that when I talk about remaking Dark Souls, I am not talking about remastering it, like this version did, or should I say didn't do. The remaster is very frustrating, not because it's a bad version of the game, but because it's more or less the same version. Personally, I think a remake could reimagine parts of Dark Souls. The second half of the game was pretty rushed, for example, and a remake could be an opportunity to fix it up, making it closer to what the game's director Miyazaki had originally envisioned for it. But I'll get into that all throughout this video. I first need to talk about Dark Souls is iconic. From the opening to the Firelink Shrine to the music, the sound effects, the atmosphere, and of course, the boss fights. These fights truly define a large part of Dark Souls, which makes it a little sad that some of these boss fights, they kinda suck. Pinwheel is an extremely easy boss fight that genuinely feels easier to beat than the typical enemy in that area. Centipede Demon is a very awkward boss fight that mostly consists of waiting and low-key makes me a little nauseous with its extreme camera shake. Moonlight Butterfly and Gwendolyn have incredibly uninteresting arenas, making for a very linear and easy fight. Capra Demon is in this very cramped space with 2 random dogs that add very little to the boss. And that's not even the entire list. For how revered the boss fights in this franchise are, they aren't very consistent in the first game. So, what if these boss fights were actually really good? What if they reduced the amount of lava in the Centipede Demon fight to make it a really dynamic and intimidating boss, where you have to make careful notes of your surroundings instead of being completely restricted by them? What if Pinwheel was actually really difficult, with a second phase that has him doing more illusions, making for really unique attacks and a memorable fight? What if Moonlight Butterfly had an open arena, where she could swoop down and lift you high in the air before dropping you again, and you'd have to time your attacks for those brief moments that she lands on the ground, instead of just waiting until she randomly gives you a couple of free hits. All of these fights have such great potential to them, and I don't think that was ever fully realized in the final game. A remake could give the team an opportunity to reimagine these fights and make them more in line with the quality of the rest of the Souls-like games. The bosses in general could benefit from being a lot more dynamic. On this playthrough in particular, I was so taken aback by how slow Ornstein and Smo moved when revisiting them. I'm so used to the speed of the Dark Souls sequels and other From Software games now that Dark Souls 1 seems a little sluggish in comparison. They could even reimagine that one boss. You know, that one boss that even the most die-hard Dark Souls fans will agree is easily the worst part of the game. Bed of Chaos is such a shocking low point in Dark Souls 1. It's not fun, it doesn't test any of the player skills that they have built up throughout the game, it's confusing for first-time players, and it's overall just a frustrating mess. If there is one boss fight I think has to be reimagined in a remake, it's this one. The Hydra fights could also use a second look. These are just such awkward waiting games where you just try to discover the right spot where you can bait him into doing his lunging attacks. And if From Software doesn't decide to redesign a lot of these boss fights in a remake, they will at the very least get a chance to tweak the hitboxes. Like, some of these are genuinely bizarre and unfair. There's a great video by Babe1 Babe2 out there detailing how weird and broken these hitboxes are.
Notice the random flickering of hitboxes appearing and disappearing on the feet, even on the side that the attack isn't even happening. All right, one last example for fun. Why is that foot a hitbox right now?
Then there are the enemies, which are admittedly mostly fine. Even the ones that do crazy toxic bleed or poison damage. The ones that leave you with half health after cursing you. The ones that insta-kill you whilst they themselves are almost impossible to kill. That's all fine. That's part of the challenge of Dark Souls. And one thing a remake should never do is make the game any easier. But what it can do is make the game less needlessly frustrating, and that's where I bring up the enemy placements. Because some of the enemy placements in this game are just there to frustrate the fuck out of you. That can be funny sometimes, but after a while it just starts to feel like an unfair challenge for the player. These don't make it feel like I have to master the game's mechanics and learn the enemy attack pattern to succeed. They feel like I'm just going to have to be lucky to either get past or kill the hordes of enemies that From Software has randomly placed there. Their AI could also benefit from a bit of an upgrade, since they often get stuck on an object and don't know what to do, or they just... And I would love to see these guys fly in Anor Londo, since it's kinda ridiculous to see them fall to their death when I just saw them fly a few minutes ago. No, wait, I saw them fly a few seconds before they died. They have a flying attack. Why can't these guys just fly up when they fall off the platform? I also wish these blue guys in the prison had better AI. The prison escape sequence is one of my favorite parts of the game, and I have really fond memories of playing through it for the first time. These guys seemed so threatening initially, but they don't do a lot of damage, and when you return when the escape sequence is over, they just kinda stand there and do nothing. I want them to be able to insta-kill the player to live up to their initial threatening introduction, but as a trade-off, they don't respawn when you kill them. The interconnected world of Dark Souls is flat out fantastic. It's so incredibly cool to see how many areas in this game loop back on each other. And the thought and planning this must have taken is crazy. The interconnected world is phenomenal, and it should absolutely be kept intact. But it does have some flaws. Let's talk about warping for a second. Dark Souls is a little infamous for the fact that you can only start warping between bonfires in the latter half of the game. Half the people love this, half the people hate this. Me? I really like that bonfire warping is initially kept from the player. Not being able to warp between bonfires does let the interconnected world shine a lot more. And I believe in large part why Dark Souls 1 is so memorable is because you get so familiar with its world through this means of traversal. It's part of Dark Souls 1's identity, and giving the player the ability to warp right away I think would do the game a great disservice. That being said, I do completely understand why some people don't like it and feel restricted by it, so I have a suggestion. Right now, the ability to warp between bonfires is given to the player when you beat Ornstein and Smo. It's a great reward for beating a tough boss fight, and I think that aspect of it should stay in. So, I suggest we move this as a reward for beating Quelaag instead. This is also the part of the game where the walkbacks start getting a little ridiculous. And with the ringing of the second bell unlocking an area that's so far back, it makes sense to me to give the player the ability to warp between bonfires at this point in the game instead. Best of both worlds. The original mechanic is still intact without overstaying its welcome. Dude, I can already see people being like, what about the lore? And like, fuck the lore. You know, for how the Lord Vessel allows you to warp, it's very ironic that you can't actually warp to it. There's only a select few bonfires available in the game to warp to, which just adds useless backtracking. Take this for example. I got a key that unlocks something in the prison, the area I just came from that doesn't have a warp point, so I walk all the way back. Now, as I was writing that down as a note and was looking away at the screen, I was actually killed. So I had to walk back again. But this time, just to be safe, I did sit at the bonfire in the prison, so in case I died again, I would respawn there. I ended up getting a Firekeeper soul with the key, so off to Firelink I go to upgrade my Estus. Whilst you can't warp to every bonfire, you can warp from every bonfire. Except for this one for story reasons, so I had to backtrack again. Seriously, just make this bonfire warpable. Make every bonfire warpable. The only warpable bonfire in the vicinity of Blighttown, the Great Hollow, and the Demon Ruins is behind a secret wall. And we really have to talk about the placements of some of these bonfires, or rather, the lack of them. There are no bonfires in New Londo, for example, which makes the walk back to the Four Kings absurd. Seath has the same problem, since there are no bonfires in the Crystal Cave, so he takes about 5 minutes to get to. There's only one bonfire in the Lost Izalith, and it's behind a hidden wall in the middle of a pool of lava, so you're forced to take damage every time you want to attempt Bed of Chaos. It's all the more frustrating when you consider that this world is a little clunky to traverse at times. Some of this 2011 geometry is so weird. Slipping off an edge and dropping like an anchor occurs an uncomfortable amount. Something that happened on my first playthrough is that I had no idea what to do in Anor Londo. I didn't realize that you were supposed to jump to this balcony. Why didn't I realize that? Because I slipped off the edge on my first jump, making me think this wasn't what I was supposed to do. This slipping is especially a problem when the game asks you to do platforming. It's why the Great Hollow is my least favorite part of Dark Souls 1. I love how hidden it is though, and the Ashen Lake is a great reward for getting through it. But rarely have I ever felt that a death in this place was my fault. From Software has shown at this point that they can do great tree platforming. There's a great tree section in Elden Ring, for example. The Great Hollow, potentially more than any other area in this game, needs the remake treatment. It's an infuriating place, and these basilisks only make it worse. Because getting hit by them means you get cursed with half health. So now the already janky platforming has less wiggle room for surviving a fall. How do you get rid of the curse? Well, you buy a purging stone from a merchant, of course. Is there one in the area? No. So you warp to an area that does have a merchant to buy some stones, and then when you warp back, oh wait, time to walk all the way back through this slow-ass mud. Do you see what I mean when I say every bonfire should just be warpable? For some, the NPCs are a highlight of Dark Souls, and I totally get why. They sport unique designs, and they pretty much all have interesting lore behind them. Few NPCs in Dark Souls are unmemorable. Few NPCs in Dark Souls are also useful. Let's talk a little about the cryptic nature of these games. I love the super hidden secrets and Easter eggs. Hearing from somebody that you get a different cutscene if you beat the DLC before Sif, or seeing a video where somebody finds the Great Hollow is an amazing experience. And it makes it feel like Dark Souls is an endless game of fun mysteries because of it. But I do wish some of this stuff was at least hinted at in the actual game. And even some stuff in the mainline quest could be explained a little better to the player. On my first playthrough, for example, I didn't know this path was going to lead back to Firelink. And technically, it doesn't. This path leads to the Valley of the Drakes, which has a path leading to New Londo, and that has a path leading to Firelink. But there is no way a first-time player would know this. I just knew that this path had poison dart shooting guys and looked like an area that you could just get an extra item in. So I initially walked all the way back through Blighttown, through the depths, and through the Undead Parish to get back to Firelink, and I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. Now, if From Software would just give warping to the player after Quelaag like I suggested, this wouldn't happen either way. But if they don't, I think they should put an NPC here that tells you that this is in fact a path back to Firelink. You could even move Quelana in front of the bridge here and have her say something like,
"What is an undead doing in such a wretched place? Lost souls like thee should take refuge at the Firelink Shrine. This path leads there. Follow it and never return, lest you go hollow."
The game does have some instances of helpful NPCs, but they're very few and far between. I would like to see a lot more NPCs give helpful information so I don't have to regularly pull up a wiki throughout my playthrough. Maybe Solaire could even give a little hint into fighting Gwyndolin when he's sitting at the Enerlando bonfire. Since I still don't know how you were supposed to piece together that if you wear the very well hidden Dark Moon Seance ring, you could find a hidden pathway below the cathedral.
This was once the fort of Great Lord Gwyn himself, you know. But he and his bloodline left Anor Londo long ago. Although rumor has it his last-born Gwyndolin is still hidden away somewhere in the city. But he will only reveal himself to those who wear the ring of his Dark Moon Covenant. Unfortunately, those who wear Dark Moon rings have now since perished. Thus, I fear they have taken the sight of a descendant of Gwyn with them to their graves.
This guy at Firelink could even give you hints to some secrets around the world since he once explored it like you.
The Ash Lake. Oh, how I long to see it. Just once. Before I go hollow. But my search for it has yielded no results. According to the old legends, it is marked by a great tree. But I have not encountered such a spectacle in my travels.
Speaking of Firelink, I think it's really annoying that some NPCs will only give you certain items or let you interact with their shop if you travel all the way back to Firelink to meet them there. This is especially annoying when you don't have fast travel yet. So I'd say give the player a chance to buy some stuff when freeing/helping an NPC before they move to Firelink. It would also be really nice if some of the Covenant NPCs could explain a little better what the benefits are of joining their Covenant. Like, I'd be okay if they flat out spoil the items they give to me, so I don't have to waste time and resources joining every Covenant to see what I can get. Honestly, the graphics aren't bad. For all its passiveness, the remaster did at the very least do a pretty decent job at making the texture sharper across the board. But there is something that I think looks really outdated and bad in Dark Souls 1, even in the remaster. The lighting. The lighting in this game can look flat out ugly at times. The sequels would drastically improve the lighting engine, leaving the first game's lighting feeling a little monotone and flat. Some lighting transitions in Dark Souls 1 are kinda disgusting. And this might just be me, but I've always found it weird how shiny everything is. Your character has a white light source tied to it, and almost everything that light source bounces off gets this weird shiny effect to it that I really don't like. It makes this whole game feel a little moist. Since we're talking about light, I want to quickly make a note of the Tomb of the Giants. This area especially is majorly affected by the weird lighting engine. The claustrophobic level of darkness here is pushed too far, and the skull lantern that you get a little while into this area, it just sucks. This is the only Souls game without a torch, and like, why? It was so requested that when Dark Souls 2 was revealed to have a regular torch, it almost became a selling point of that game. So just put it in Dark Souls 1 as well. Have Pinwheel drop it on Def or make it available at some merchant. Just anything else than this. The world design could also use a little touch-up. Again, the graphics are mostly still good, and the one thing you can guarantee a remake doing is making the graphics look better. But I do want to highlight some areas that need some extra tender love and care. That little forest area before the Crystal Cave feels like a beta area that somehow made it into the final game. The forest is so flat looking, and these crystal guys are just randomly scattered around in corners for no real reason. This entire place should just be reimagined from the ground up. Expand the area and make it its own little section, including a little bonfire somewhere in the middle and enemies that are specifically made for it. Right now, this feels like an area in a video game rather than an existing place with its own history. The upgrade to current gen hardware could also open up new graphical possibilities. Why not make the painted world of Ariamis actually look painted? I can sort of see a slight hint of this in the final game, but with the new hardware, let's just go all the way and give it a similar look to something like Memories Retold. Other areas could be made a little more spacious. Blighttown instantly comes to mind since the camera can have a pretty rough time maneuvering around the tight spaces here. And I know Anorlando is supposed to be abandoned, but man, could this place get some more props or furniture, please? The city feels so unnecessarily big and empty, and after that initial wow factor of seeing Anorlando for the first time wears off, walking around this place starts to become really boring. Especially after all the enemies disappear when you break the Guinevere illusion. The next part, I myself am a little conflicted about, and I'd love to hear what the community overall thinks of this. Should the Estus Flask system be changed? So instead of it having the kindling mechanic, it's more in line with the sequels of finding Estus shards throughout the world to increase flask usage. On the one hand, it would make the experience of playing the game in remake form even more different, and I find that very appealing. On the other hand, I do understand that this is part of Dark Souls 1's DNA, and it might be a little too much to just throw it away. I'm really 50-50 on this, but if they end up sticking with the kindling mechanic, can they please make it so that pressing kindling just instantly makes you human and kindles the bonfire in a single press, rather than having to turn human again and then pressing kindle? It's a little thing, but it became annoying rather quickly. The overall UI really needs the upgraded versions from the sequels. Endlessly scrolling through these menus is so slow and feels unintuitive. An extra ring slot would also be greatly appreciated. Not because I want them to make the game any easier for me, but because only 2 leaves for very little experimentation. You can get the favor and protection ring really early on in Dark Souls 1. Taking it off means losing it forever, so you essentially have only 1 ring slot. And oftentimes you need to use a ring to even traverse certain areas. So even that second slot is occupied most of the time. I just want that 1 extra slot to give me more opportunities to use different rings, because every playthrough I just sort of stick to the same ones. I'm also of the opinion that Dark Souls 1 doesn't really benefit from the armor upgrading. You always get new pieces of armor, so it's not really worth spending all the Titanite on a single set. It can also overwhelm new players, presenting them with too many things to spend their souls on. The sequels also ditched the armor upgrading, and ultimately, I think that's for the better. Another thing that the sequels added in terms of armor and weapons is that they automatically get repaired when you sit at a bonfire. I can't even tell you how many times I saw this weapon at risk prompt on screen when I was recording. Repairing barely costs any souls, so it's just this extra useless step that I started doing every time I sat at a bonfire. On the topic of my weapon, when I infused it with lightning damage, I started to notice that the lightning hit sound effect is the exact same every time. The usage of same sound effects gets worse when entering the Lost Izalith, because the same half-a-second lava damage sound effect loops constantly here, and it's super loud. Some additional sound work could go a long way in a remake, just saying. When warping, you aren't automatically assigned to the bonfire you warp to. So when you die and you didn't sit at the bonfire you warped to, you just get sent back and you have to needlessly warp again. Man, I'm starting to feel like I've been really negative about Dark Souls 1. We should switch it up and talk about something really good in this game. The Ula Seal DLC of Dark Souls 1 is phenomenal. I specifically wanted to give it its own section because it fixes most of the problems I have with the main game. All the fights are dynamic, the environment's lush and polished, there's a dark area that's actually good and doesn't suffer from the same problems that the Tomb of Giants suffers from. I feel the overall lighting is improved a little, I love the colors used here, and you can warp to every single bonfire in the DLC. The presentation is so good. Encountering Calamite throughout is just really fucking cool, and the direction of the cutscenes has been greatly improved. Playing this DLC is like getting a little glimpse into what a potential remake of this game could look like. It was pretty surreal to play it for this video with the idea of a remake in mind. Suddenly, there it was. Most of the changes I wanted to see. Not all of it, mind you, but it's confirmation to me that From Software themselves have problems with the main game that they would like to see fixed. In fact, after going over all my problems throughout this video and playing the DLC, I'm starting to think Dark Souls 1 is not only ready for a remake, I'm starting to think it's inevitable. I've spent a lot of time in this video talking about what I think a remake should change, but I think it's just as important to talk about what a remake shouldn't change. Don't make the storytelling more traditional. Piecing together the whole story via environmental clues, item descriptions, and obscure dialogue is a special experience that this game kinda revolutionized. It's important that it stays preserved, just like the overall atmosphere of the game. Don't make any drastic changes to the character designs like the Demon Souls remake did. And for the love of God, don't make this game any easier. Dark Souls is about overcoming challenges and achieving what feels like the impossible. And can I just say, I love Dark Souls. Even in its current state, it's such a special game to me that I enjoy on every playthrough. I own this game 6 times, and I'll buy it again day 1 when it does get a remake. And if I'm wrong and the game never ends up getting a remake, I'll continue to play and enjoy Dark Souls 1 anyway, for the rest of time.
And here we have the crystalline entity in its natural habitat. A simple creature at heart, the crystalline entity will stand around and do nothing for most of its life. Unless, of course, it has found a mate. Then it will travel to a cozy corner where it will begin the mating ritual. When the mating is finished, the female will turn golden, and once the child is ready to arrive, it shall pop out of its mother. But some crystalline entities are not welcome in their own community. They are banished, and many of them will travel to their new home, their local